Welcome to Composer Conversations. I'm your host, David Coscina, and for this inaugural episode, I'll be chatting with Christopher Willis on his fantastic new score to Armando Iannucci's The Personal History of David Copperfield. Willis is an Emmy-nominated composer of film, television, and game music. Credits include music for the award-winning series Veep, Disney Mickey Mouse, and Disney Junior's The Lion Guard. Willis's first feature film score to the Death of Stalin in 2017 generated critical acclaim and catapulted him into the spotlight as a composer to watch out for. I spoke with Christopher about his formative years in music, his experiences in academia, and some of the principles that he's applied towards his latest score, The Personal History of David Copperfield. What was the catalyst that inspired you towards a career in music?
I often find when people ask me this question that the biggest single spark was all sort of bound up with my granddad when I was a little kid. He was an engineer, but he was also an amateur pianist and loved music theory. And I remember having a conversation with him. I must have learned a tiny bit of piano at that point, just talking about the harmonic series and about chords, and he would show me like some tiny little thing, like just a nice little spacing of a chord, and I would realize I could go off, and with that one thing I could fool around and create something different, and that was a very sort of moment, an important sort of interaction for me, that kind of problem solving, hands-on, nuts and bolts, almost sort of engineering type attitude to music that I sort of spark that I got from my granddad.
And then you went, I guess you started studying piano at 8, and then went to the Royal Academy of Music for piano performance, right? You were more going in that vein or that line rather than composing early on. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I was just very keen on music of all sorts. As a teenager, and then gradually more just like focusing on classical music, but still in a very sort of general way. And I did my undergrad at Cambridge, which is sort of a fairly dry academic course, a bit like if you went to university to study English literature rather than acting or directing or writing or something. So in Britain, there is, I don't know if this is still the case, but it used to be the case that there was some anxiety about putting all your eggs in one basket and studying piano, say, or composition right out of the gate as an undergrad. I don't know if this is a sort of peculiarly British thing, but since I was still showing signs of being interested in lots of things, I was encouraged to go to Cambridge and do the undergrad there. I think was a good idea for me. But once I was there, I started playing the piano all the time, and after my undergrad was finished, I went off to London and studied the piano, and sort of thought that I was just going to be a pianist. But yeah, after a few years of that, I was finding that my brain was always thinking about writing music and just about thinking about music in so many other ways. I was sort of struggling with really committing to that lifestyle. I sort of became a concert pianist, and I was traveling around and doing recitals, not kind of at the top level, but I was that would be what you'd have to describe my career as, and I just was finding that it wasn't a perfect fit for me. So I went back to Cambridge again, and I was very grateful to this sense that universities sometimes can give you of being a sort of refuge. I felt that Cambridge was doing a job that it had been set up, 800 years earlier to do, of sort of taking taking confused scholars and giving them kind of another chance to figure out who they are. So I went back out of the real world, back into Cambridge again, and with that extra bit of time in my 20s, I suddenly seemed to change direction, and I was teaching music in various ways. I was teaching analysis, teaching composition, and I just started getting really fired up about writing music, and then specifically about film music. And I carried on playing the piano. I mean, I still play the piano now, but I just suddenly felt this like real kind of sort of fire under my arse that I hadn't felt, I think, when I'd just been playing the piano.
In a recent interview, I remember reading that you felt that you were railroaded into modern music in the 90s as a student, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is a subject I've struggled to articulate the full range of my feelings about, actually, each time I've tried to talk about it. If you were a young person within classical music in Britain and you wanted to write music, you were expressing an enthusiasm in that way, you could only really get your teachers to keep teaching you about the history of music and tonal composition until you were sort of in your mid-teens. I mean, gradually, that you could keep doing it as an academic thing into undergrad. But if you actually went to a composition teacher and asked for composition lessons, or if you entered a composition in a competition, which actually I did when I was about 9, and the treatment that I received at about the age of 9 for writing something. No, I was a bit older, maybe 11 or 12, from some very high-minded composer that had come down from London to Sussex, where I lived. It was just very sort of ideologically dogmatic, and you had to teach yourself, and you had to sort of seek refuge in increasingly academic parts of music education where you could keep doing. So in Cambridge, I was hardly in a bad situation because they had a compulsory fugue paper in the last year, so I was fine. I just needed to keep studying those kinds of things. But it's very confusing to feel that you're being told so firmly that music history had this sort of organic life cycle, and tonality died in 1913, and to go back would be not only misguided but sort of evil somehow. I mean, there was such sort of absurdly dogmatic feelings in the air, and as I said earlier, my feelings about it are complicated because I went from sort of as a mid-teenager having a real kind of cut off and not even really wanting to listen to anything after about The Rite of Spring, then becoming very fiercely in favor of modern music, sort of jumping on what I felt was a bandwagon, maybe at 17, 18, and then kind of flipping back again in my 20s, thinking this is ridiculous. I want to understand music, and I've been led down a weird blind alley. And now, come forward, I'm 41 now. My feelings are much, much more complicated than that. I mean, there's an absolutely vast amount of 20th century music, modern music that I like, and that I love even. I think it's a period in music history that we're going to be picking over, and and in some ways I just had to arrive at my own conclusions about things. I mean, I came back to The Rite of Spring, for instance, I just said that, so let's talk about that. After a few years of being a musicologist, and I was like, this piece of music is essentially tonal, and the syntax is this very interesting, weird, additive Stravinsky thing, but the syntax is very similar to music from previous centuries, and tonally he's just muddying the waters, but mostly it's these folk songs, and they're in keys, and they have tonics, and it was partly the way in which I'd been taught about them, and I'd been told that the logic of music now was this freaky thing involving kind of numerals and fractions, and none of your instincts were reliable. It was partly a way in which 20th century music was taught, I think, rather than the music itself. There was a suspicion I had, and as I say, my feelings about this are mellowing over the years, so I have a lot of sympathy for anyone that was in this situation. I had a sort of suspicion that many of the teachers were now second, third, fourth generation sort of modern music specialists, and so felt slightly like they were being put on the spot if they were asked, detailed questions about older music. By the 90s, you had generations of composers and composition teachers who had kind of drunk the Kool-Aid and committed themselves to a lifetime of listening to modern music, and perhaps had slight anxieties themselves that they had skipped things, and that it was, they'd undergone the same sort of slightly problematic education that I was just talking about, and so they were kind of in psychologically a complicated place. Some hot-headed kid, pianist in my case, saying, "God, why won't you teach me about Beethoven? What's this chord? What's that chord?" And they'd be on much. They'd feel they were on much safer ground, talking about Burt Whistle or Brian Ferneyhough.
Having a background in academia, I'm just curious what you think the biggest misconception is of film music or film composers, for that matter.
Well, for many years, I think film music was probably a source of embarrassment to academia, because film music wasn't going in the same direction as classical music. Film music was much more under sort of market pressure. Film music was sort of existing in a capitalist bubble, and classical music was sort of state-sponsored. So the sort of question of why is film music the way it is? Now I think that's sort of slightly less of an embarrassment. Now that classical music is becoming sort of more pluralist, it's less uncomfortable. And of course, there was always film music that was very spiky. There was cartoon music and there was horror music, and film music's always been quite a rough and tumble, and it still is now. I don't know quite what the attitude in academia it is, but I guess there needs to be an awareness of the harsh reality of film music. That things get changed up until the last minute. Perhaps film music suffered from. I'm sort of spitballing here, but perhaps film music suffered in a similar way, actually, to the way opera sometimes suffers in musicology. What did somebody, maybe Joseph Kerman, said? There are basically two views on opera. One is that it's bad concert music, and one is that it's bad theatre. And both views completely fail to understand that opera is something else. It's not the same as symphonic music, and it's not the same as spoken theatre. And you could say something similar about film music, that it's doing something different from other kinds of music that you might know that sound sort of superficially similar. I think perhaps the relationship between the film and the music isn't truly appreciated for what it is. That the two things, right since the inception of sound in film, have been closely married together, and the film composers have been incredibly dexterous at following the course of the music. I remember actually from a little bit of academic study of film music that I did when I was a student, the musicologists were almost more comfortable with films where the music was borrowed from somewhere else and didn't really fit the film, because it sort of invited all sorts of clever things to say. Whereas normal Franz Waxman, Sunset Boulevard film music kind of baffled people a bit. I think they didn't kind of realize how incredibly clever a mainstream film score can be when you compare it with the film and when you see and hear exactly what it's doing. And there's actually a practical problem, which is that an orchestral film score is so cumbersome. It's hard to get hold of the film with just the music or with the music taken out. I think perhaps there are resources we could all do with that we still don't really have. I would say maybe if you wanted me to do a discussion of one of my own scores, I would say at a bare minimum, I need a copy of the film in which I can switch the music or the dialogue off and on, and I'd need something like a piano transcription of the score. I'd rather not use the whole full score because everyone's just turning pages constantly. I think possibly we lack the tools to really look and listen in the way that we should. But I'm probably 15 years out of date. Great things, I imagine, are probably happening in that field of study right now.
Director Armando Iannucci, in a recent promo for The Personal History of David Copperfield, had gone on saying how you don't write music that sounds like film music. You write music that sounds original. And I'm wondering, that begs the question, what differentiates film music from orchestral or concert music?
Well, something that I found when I was doing The Death of Stalin is that real concert music sort of always wants to have a will of its own. You know, it wants to the musical ideas are working themselves out. You know, they're liquidating, they're dying, and another one appears, or they're mutating. And in film music, you sometimes have to do such strange things that you can't just waltz into writing film music and use exactly the same muscle that you've trained to write concert music, I think. And an example that I use is a scene in The Death of Stalin where I'm going along. It's in the final reel of the film, and I'm going along, and I'm trying to sound, you know, like Soviet music in the 50s. But there's lots of action as the army are clearing places out, and it's all quite violent. And then the main characters all get stuck in the toilet. The most sensible thing, spotting-wise, is for the music to stay in, because it's going to be back again soon. And there's a rule of thumb in film music that if you can stay in unobtrusively rather than have two short cues, that's normally better because it's less disruptive. You risk drawing attention to yourself by constantly disappearing and coming back. So I decided to stay in, but I had to sort of stay in character as Shostakovich, but under dialogue and not going anywhere. So I have to demonstrate a very specific and strange capacity, which is to sort of percolate. In fact, people in film music use the word percolate quite a lot, which is sort of percolate without actually going anywhere, sort of modulating a little bit this way and that and varying the phrase lengths a bit, but having, as I write, this immense urge to, you know, crescendo and having to constantly suppress that. Oh, well, there's a wonderful style of music that I'm full of admiration for at the moment, and that's the kind of thing Jeff Beal has been doing for silent movies. Jeff Beal is, of course, the composer of House of Cards and lots of other things. But I recently saw a score that he did to the silent movie Sunrise, amazing film that came right at the end of the silent movie era. And when Jeff scores a silent movie, he doesn't score it as sympathetically as he would if he were doing House of Cards. But he doesn't just completely ignore it. It's not just a sort of exercise in juxtaposition. He sort of allows himself this degree of abstraction between the two things. I'm making a motion here that you can't see with a sort of like a piece of rope, letting rope out on a boat. That's very interesting. Hearing that makes you sort of realize that there's a continuum there. You've got music that's very tightly matched to picture, and then you've got music that has no interest in anything except itself. And then there's actually a kind of middle ground, and that sort of makes you realize that the middle ground is being used in films quite a lot. You know, there's a feeling of, if the music just ignores most of what's on the screen, there's a feeling almost of zooming out, sort of a musical wide-angled shot. And then if you're very tight, and like I do in Mickey Mouse cartoons, very often matching the action precisely, you get a very sort of trivializing, humorous kind of effect.
Regarding the architecture of David Copperfield, did you compose a long theme and then split it up depending on what the scene or the character or the sequence called for, but ostensibly had a large formed idea? Or was it an amalgam of smaller incidental ideas that all congealed for the climactic cue, which is David's writings.
It's a sort of halfway house, at least in the way I've been writing recently. So if you saw my sketches were on paper, because I do use a pencil and paper when I'm starting, you'd see mostly melodies and motives and stuff. And in fact, you'd see a lot of things that didn't make it into the film, but you'd notice that they're vaguely similar. So there are sort of different ideas that I was wrestling with early on. And then there's a sort of middle ground, and I often think about this actually now because I used to be very into music analysis. There's a middle ground between those sorts of sketches and any sort of sketch that actually is through composed. And the middle ground is not written down. The middle ground is an obsessive noodling and improvising at the keyboard that I'll do for long periods of time. And that, of course, that doesn't. If one goes back and thinks about great composers, if they were doing this, then that is a part of the process that you never get to see. I can exploit to some extent the tendency for movies to start. You almost always want a movie to have a sense of groping towards its thematic material early on. Certainly in David Copperfield, you did. Actually, I must say in The Death of Stalin, you didn't. You kind of wanted the main theme bang in one of those first slow motion things, and so I did just have to decide exactly what it was and put it right there in reel one. But in David Copperfield, there was a sense that we were finding the identity of the music, and so to some extent I could actually use that. And I had that sort of a 4-chord thing. So that I arrived at while I was wrestling with how to do that very first bustling cue. I was trying to find something for it to coalesce around, so it wasn't just a splurge of C major. And I'd been already looking at lots of English music and trying to think of shapes that felt vaguely in the English symphonic tradition, but not gesturing at anything in particular. And so I was very interested in that. And you'll have noticed that there's lots of there's kind of da da. There's a lot of these note pairs da da. So I was noticing that and toying with lots of ideas that were using those chords and using those notes. And so as I was composing cues in the film, I think I was always, in my improvising and noodling, I was always, say, about a reel ahead, and had all these sort of half-formed ideas and ways of developing that material that were very messy, but were much more sort of symphonic and interesting than the sort of basic things that I'd written in my sort of sketchbook. So probably I basically had an idea that we were going to gesture, we were going to move towards that main theme that plays, that's sort of the summer thing. And as I worked on it in those cues, sort of extra bits and connections started to sort of emerge. And so by the time probably I was actually writing the final reel, I'd been very loosely experimenting with pretty much everything that you were going to get in the rest of the film, and then in the final, that sort of chambery cue that plays at the very end, it's sort of been distilled into one kind of melody, sort of. That I definitely didn't have that at the very start, but I sort of had a feeling that it would probably settle down and that would probably be doable. I think to some extent the slightly messy process is necessary if you're going to be comfortable with the actual filmmaking process, because if you sort of commit all of your emotional investment into some very specific thing and then find that cue gets taken out or shortened or something, then it's very distressing. But if you're totally immersed in something for many months and noodling around it all the time, as I'm saying, there's actually a certain amount of flexibility. You probably noticed that the Mock Turtle, the piano cue, nods at the same material a bit. In the middle, it sort of starts to... But, it didn't have to. It could have not done that at all. And maybe in an ideal world, I might have thought that the opening of it, the whole thing would just be the main melody, and I couldn't make that work. So the solution I came up with was a sort of middle ground. there are many, more than one way to skin a cat, and so by the end, hopefully, one has this thing that feels very committed and very unified. But actually, there are other ways it could have gone. And it's funny, actually. I'm just yesterday started working on I want to make an orchestral suite version of The Death of Stalin, and I'm finding all these offcuts of cues that I actually forgot ever even existed. Because even in my mind, it gradually solidifies. Once we do the soundtrack album, and I do podcasts like this, and I go to study groups in LA with my score under my arm and talk about it, it starts to sort of congeal and seem like this very kind of settled thing. And then I go off and look, and I realize that until the last minute, a certain cue had 4 extra bars that created this really nice connection with another cue, and that's now gone, or stuff like that.
I think Vaughan Williams said to students at one point that every composer or composition student should try their hand at film scoring, because they can't deliberate forever. At some point, they have to make a decision and go with it.
It teaches you a lot about what matters and what can be lost, what can be salvaged. What you should cling to, because if you take this very pragmatic attitude and you go to even very tight, very tightly constructed pieces of classical music, you can still, in a sense, sort of detect some of that there. You sort of think, well, the stretto worked up to a point, but then it didn't, and he had to just change. He had to change one of the parts, or the theme comes back in the third movement in triple time, but it didn't work all the way, so he went as far as he could. Actually, there's a lovely book whose attitude to that I always admired, and that's Bach and the Patterns of Invention by Lawrence Dreyfus, where he kind of takes that attitude to Bach. He's particularly interested in ritornello type pieces, where you've got a block of material at the start, and then and he says, really, if you look at the material that's at the start, and you actually go through the process of fiddling with it to work out what you can do with it, you find that he's done that. He's used every part of the buffalo. And if you try inverting one bit of it, say, putting one part on top of another, and you find it works for 2.5 beats, and then it doesn't. And you go off and look in the piece, and you find, lo and behold, it's exactly what Bach did. He used it for a bit, and then he went off into a flight of fancy, and no one would know. No one perceives that as being a kind of compromise. I think that is very perceptive about, I think, that the way composition really works.
It's a lot like sculpting too. Sometimes, as you were saying, these ideas begin as these kind of overall amorphous masses of an idea, and then they have to be kind of whittled down and repurposed or sort of bent and stretched and pulled in various directions before they kind of find their definition.
Right, yeah, and that sort of gets at a quality, I think, which is that things can become very non-verbal. The person is wrestling with a problem at great length for a long time. It becomes very tangible to them, possibly difficult to articulate why they felt the way they did. But yeah, and as you can sort of imagine with a sculpture, as you sort of just pull the thing until it feels right.
Copperfield's a very kinetic score in a lot of ways. Was that something that you had to convince Armando of, or was he always interested in minimalism, sort of that minimalist vibe or feel to the score, among other influences? What was what was the music that he kind of brought to the table as far as influences?
Yeah, I feel like I'm probably, one of the most fortunate people working in Hollywood, because I'm working with Armando, who's someone whose frame of reference musically is very wide and very high-minded, just instinctively. So he's very open to sort of anything sonically that you might hear, in concert music. There was an earlier version of that first cue. There was a brief sketch that I did where I was thinking that things might be even more sort of grotesque. It was tonally hard to pin down, and I was experimenting with having like fife and harpsichord and sort of Englishness in a different way. And what I discovered about the way Armando was thinking about the film is that the music, actually, the most valuable job the music can do is to sort of bind the film together. The people are on screen are weird enough already. They don't really need to be helped by, sort of choreographed whimsically or strangely by the music. The performances sort of just work on their own. So, but he did want this. He did want the start of the film to be very kinetic, and he loves minimalism, and so the idea, after that more grotesque idea, the idea started to emerge in my mind that maybe it should. I had just read the book, so I had a lot of thoughts in my head about the feeling that the book gives you. Sort of, I just was thinking that we should set off and not really know exactly what sort of thing we're in for. So that idea of like starting with C major, but with a cluster, sort of seemed interesting. I think when I'd been thinking about more grotesque stuff, there's a piece of Hindemith that I'd been listening to, and I actually now can't remember. It's there's a series of Kammermusik pieces, but I can't remember which one it is. It's one of those that starts with a kind of it's a more dissonant cluster, but sort of some of my listening that had been more grotesque kind of sort of stayed with me when I was trying to produce this slightly cleaner version. And then there was an idea. I was probably simultaneously working on that one and Baby Davy, which you won't know because you haven't seen the film, but it starts with a white screen from David's point of view as a baby, with nothing in focus. This is very close to the book. There's a wonderful passage in the book where he kind of describes trying to uncover his very earliest memories, sort of shapes emerging from nothingness. It's an amazing read. It's so modern and striking. And so for that cue, I was probably already experimenting with starting it in a sort of cluster C major, and then ever the pretentious composer, I thought, well, actually, we could do that both times. It's easy, the idea is pretty obvious when you see the white screen of sort of starting with this blur of C major. Then the sort of vigorous one that starts the film is sort of a slightly less obvious version of the same thing.
Even though the film is set in a specific time period, the music doesn't make it feel like it's tied to a specific era and spans a lot of different styles.
The temp on this film was sort of a puzzle to be solved because Armando uses temp quite sort of freely, but he doesn't tend to use film music. He tends to use concert music, and he doesn't use it with any confidence that it'll stay there very long. So it's quite liberating as the composer, because you kind of know why it's there, but it's relatively easy to throw it away and forget about it. And stylistically, actually, I spent some time with too much going on in the score, that it was too much of a smorgasbord. I was kind of bouncing off these temp pieces a bit too much. So part of the process of distillation as I worked on the score was concentrating more on certain themes and sort of bringing things close towards each other, so that it does seem to be winking and nodding in lots of different places. But at an early point it was sort of seasick. And actually Armando helped me to sort of puzzle that out, and the editor Peter Lambert, because we started to take cues from one place and put them in another, and that then left the way open to me to write not exactly the same cue, but another one that was sort of an evolution of the same idea.
Do you think a score as sophisticated as David Copperfield needs a director with that kind of vision, or at least understanding of music, and to that level? Is that what a film composer really requires to write something of that level these days?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? There's sort of Hollywood law that says that for many years the limitations in how a composer could actually demonstrate to a filmmaker what the music was going to be like the fact that the composer really just sat at the piano and said, oh, and this will be the trombones, and then it'll go, sort of selling it, meant that the conventional wisdom is that gave composers more freedom to do what they wanted. So music tended to be sort of quite high-minded through much of the 20th century, because there was only so much that anyone else could do. They basically had to hire someone that had a track record and believe them when they told them that it was going to be great. And then as a demoing process, as the technology changed in the 80s and 90s, directors were more in a position to say, you know what, that's too frilly for me, it's too, sounds like classical music, and we started to get this more primal in some ways, primal and harmonically sort of pop-oriented sound that film music has had. Yeah, does that mean that at this point you need a certain kind of director? I don't know if I've just been very, very blessed so far. I've been finding there is a hunger in quite a few of the people that I've been working with to try different things. I come with my endless obsession with all sorts of vintage and flamboyant kind of orchestral details. Maybe we're about to see a whole generation of composers and film music that is more colourful and sort of looking back, looking backwards a little more freely. Another thing that one hears in Hollywood at the moment is that the old guard who were composing in a very classical way found it hard to keep up with the technology, and so there was then a generation of composers whose capacity to integrate modern sounds into their scores kind of really set them apart. But now possibly everyone's so literate with computers and everyone's so literate with pop culture that you're getting a new kind of synthesis possibly emerging. You've got people like Ludwig Göransson and Joe Trapanese, people who I would say have both sides of the equation so well covered, are impressive on both sides. So it could be an interesting time the next few years.
Which leads me to ask, how do you feel about technology in film and composing?
I think the computers found it very difficult to demo really, really good orchestral music, or there was a real clash between what the computer wanted to do and what the composer wanted to do. So you tended to find, for several decades, I think, that any time a composer tried to do something sort of legit, there was a risk that it didn't sound very good in the demo, and it died a death. And every time the composer went the other way and did something that the computer found easy to do, it tended to get the green light. And now possibly we're getting to a point where there are so many sample libraries, there's so many sort of life hacks, and everyone's comparing notes and little cheats with each other. The demos still don't sound that good, but they sound good enough that you can sell a greater range of traditional things. Possibly I'm finding that where a few years ago I used to always hear composers saying that anything they showed a director that wasn't very realistic tended to get shot down and the demo was at fault. I almost feel like maybe filmmakers are becoming better at listening to demos as the years go by, and they're understanding that the demo is a little bit like an animatic or a little bit like a storyboard. That if they trust you, that'll actually help things out a lot, because things that sound really rubbish in the demo might actually end up being the things that sound coolest and most sort of ravishing in real life.
I was going to ask you, when your transition from traditional composing to the more computer-based writing style that's prevalent in film, how did you find that whole process?
I was interested in computers before I came to LA. I'd gone through a sort of phase in my early teens of using computers and sequencing sort of little poppy things. So I wasn't completely sort of ignorant of MIDI and things like that, although I had gone off heavily into classical music by the time I was in my 20s. I think I was enormously fortunate that I went. It was a culture shock, to be to be fair. But I went basically from Cambridge, where I was literally, had leather patches on my elbows and was teaching undergrads to do Palestrina and fugue and things, to my job in the studio of Rupert Gregson-Williams, and his studio was at Hans Zimmer's place, remote control. So I was right in the thick of the bit of LA that is most computer literate, and people were. I sort of get the sense now it was kind of a golden age there. There were a lot of composers there who were just starting out, who are now doing great things, and it was very, very challenging for me. But I did learn a lot very quickly. I basically just had to. There was no halfway houses really. There was no question of maybe I'll just use Sibelius and give people Sibelius demos. I had to just completely abandon writing anything by hand or even using Sibelius. I had to completely commit to, you work in Cubase, you're presenting audio. I mean, that was a time already when Hans's demos sounded very, very realistic. So that was sort of the school of thought I was alluding to, where you don't really do anything that you're embarrassed about in the demo. Everything you do has to be something that works, and if that means you use a lot of staccato and a lot of whole notes, then you just do that. But it was really good for me. It sort of taught me an enormous amount about movies and spotting and time code and just a million kinds of things that I didn't know anything about. And then after a few years, it was up to me to sort of try and remember who I'd been before I got sucked into Hollywood, and gradually adjust my studio, which sort of still looks vaguely remote control-y, adjust everything and reintegrate all of the sort of old school things that I was interested in, and start buying scores again, and buy myself a piano and buy myself a pad of paper, and just kind of relearn all of the old things. I would say I was very, very fortunate and lucky to start on one extreme, and then in my late 20s in Santa Monica to suddenly be on the other extreme. That sort of set me up quite well. So now I would say my method is sort of, I start at the piano, unless the score is very sound designy. If the score has any chance of having a tune, then I kind of want to know what the tune is early on. Mm-hmm. So I'll start at the piano. Lots of writing on paper, because I still think writing on paper is very powerful. If you're still working ideas out, and then I'll move to the computer, but still be based on the piano in the computer. I'll compose without the click, without any tempo track at first. That's something that's sort of a concession to a slightly more classical method that I have now. And then I'll make the tempo track fit what I wrote. So I'll sort of get more technical as I go along. I'll start old school and then get gradually more engrossed in samples and technology.
Do you use retrospective record in Cubase at all? I
do. That's a very specific question, but yes, I love it actually. I don't know why I love it so much. Lots of composers I know also love it. It's somehow just really suits me. In fact, often I'll just, even if I know that I'm about to record, I still won't hit record until after I played something.
Maybe it's psychological. Maybe the fact that you're not recording, that you there's this sort of freedom to try things out.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is something to that. There's a spontaneity that comes with not really thinking that you are committing. Often my thoughts often go back to 200 or 300 years ago, and whether it was possible to have mental tricks that achieved a lot of these same things without the technology. I spent a lot of time studying Scarlatti, Domenico Scarlatti, and his syntax is so weird often. In fact, people have often suggested that he might somehow have had someone transcribing while he was playing. But if you actually think about that for 5 seconds, it makes no sense. But I understand why people say that. It makes no sense because when you're playing about 15 notes a second, and a single note takes about 1 second to write.
Yeah, I think you're right too. I think that the way that technology has gone and the processes of music writing, we're sort of seeing a renaissance. I don't know if you saw that Steinberg roundtable that was with Hans and Benjamin Wallfish and a few other folks, maybe Jeff Rona, and they were all saying how a few of them were saying that they use retrospective record, but they also just use a piano patch rather than mocking up right off the bat when they're coming up with these formative ideas, and they just use it sort of traditionally like Stravinsky would have done, banging away at the piano and sort of figuring things out and then writing them down. It's interesting how it's kind of moving full circle.
Right, and I think if you look at, what did they call them? Beethoven would write I think we often call it a continuity draft. That is a draft he would try and get down that was just trying to get the sort of structure of the whole composition on one staff. And the messiness of those continuity drafts strongly suggests to me someone who is basically getting the thing together at the piano and has a strong sort of gestural sense of the piece. It's slightly different every time. And he's picking up the pen and just trying to get the barest skeleton onto the page so that he doesn't forget what he was doing. All of that sort of suggests to me that the way that a lot of us are composing at the moment, where we do use the piano and use the computer to capture what the piano does, I think that would have been very attractive to composers in the past. There's a sort of myth of a composer, with their quill and their thoughts. But I think composers have always been very, very attached to their keyboards, and getting the music from the stage of being kind of messy and gestural and improvisatory onto the page has always been one of the main challenges. I believe there's a Mozart letter, and I've wanted to find it because it sort of tells you a lot, but I haven't been able to find it. So maybe it doesn't really exist. But I've been told there's a Mozart letter where he says, "I'm really stressed because I've just moved house and I have something I need to write, and my piano hasn't arrived, so I can't do anything," which completely contravenes the sort of Amadeus image we have of Mozart doing everything in his head. Why would he say that if he didn't if that weren't true?
So jumping from Mozart to the present, I'm just wondering what the future has in store for you as far as projects, Chris.
Oh, well, in a few weeks, actually, I'm going to Florida with my wife, Elise, and we are going to see the opening of a big Mickey and Minnie attraction at Disney World, Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. We wrote the song. It's structured around a song, and we wrote the song together, and I wrote all the music.
Wonderful.
There's a ton of music in it, actually. You'd be amazed at the enormous amount. So that's going to be amazing and very freaky, I should think, to be suddenly immersed in this experience. In fact, there are two attractions. There's that one, and there's a special Mickey short that's only viewable in this one theatre at Disney World. So we've just been finishing that as well. I'm doing an animated movie, Lamia's Poem, later this year, which I'm very excited about. It's about a Syrian refugee who finds a book of Rumi poetry, and then has a sort of there's a kind of fantasy element of her interacting with the poet Rumi. So I'm excited about this sort of chance to just be very flamboyant, a big kind of animated score. Really looking forward to that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it already as well.
Oh, cheers.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher, for your time. Lovely conversing with you, and hope we get to do it again sometime.
Well, you too. Yeah, really, really nice. And to be continued.
Thank you for listening to Cinematic Sound Radio. I want to thank Tim Burden for providing his voice for all the bumpers and stingers you hear throughout the program, and David Coscina for providing Cinematic Sound Radio's theme music. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. You can find us on social media at CinSound Radio on Twitter and Cinematic Sound on Facebook. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment right now to rate and review the show. It really helps us rise through the ranks and helps potential new listeners find the show. And don't forget to check out Cinematic Sound Radio at cinematicsound.net.